let's try rogue elephant if it's open.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining in. I hope everybody can hear me. We are going to kickstart this today workshop. Welcome. Thank you for joining in, and thank you for joining in on time. We're going to start off with the workshop now, and I'll quickly introduce myself. I'll quickly introduce the concept of the workshop as well. If there's any questions that you have to start off with, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll keep looking at the chat box. And apart from that, may I request that people who are not speaking, if you could keep your microphones on mute, that will help all the rest of the participants to hear clearly. This workshop is conducted by Meeple Labs, which is one of the offshoots of the board game design group of India. And it started off as a seminar series, and it's essentially a conversation for board game designers. So the whole idea of coming out with this workshop started off when the board game editing style guide was being discussed and was shared in the group. And what I thought was I'd have a quick workshop that spans over 2 days, not very intense, but sufficient enough to allow all our participants and every member who's joining in to understand a little bit about rulebook writing and help them to hopefully structure their rulebooks well in future. So, having said that, we'll start off. This is day one. This will be a 1 hour session, and due credit to Michael Kirby Lee, whose board game editing style guide is the base of most of what you're going to be seeing today, along with my own experience with writing published rule books. So I've been writing rule books for a bit now. I've done about 5 rule books, including rule books for simple games by Indian publishers and a pretty complex Euro game for a publisher based out of Italy that's due to be launched on Kickstarter somewhere about Q1 of 2021. So uh, I will be sharing some of my experience as well over there so that it could help those of you that are writing rule books for yourselves. This workshop and the content within it is under Creative Commons. So feel free to mix it, feel free to distribute it. Just to make sure that wherever you do so, you need to attribute the author. So in this case, you need to attribute Michael Lee Kirby as well as myself. And you need to ensure that you redistribute any content that you create based out of this under the same license. The intention of this is to ensure that this content is open source and available to everybody in the industry so that as many people as possible can benefit from this open source knowledge. And of course, it's a non-commercial agreement. Okay, moving forward. So write your rule books right. And here's where we kickstart. A little bit about me. So, for those of you who've been attending the Meeple Labs seminars, you would know me. I am Franz Dias. I host the Meeple Labs seminars that happen on a monthly basis. This is effectively our 5th seminar series, and we are doing it in the form of a workshop. By day, I am a digital product manager and a UX practitioner as well. So you'll see quite a bit of UX concepts peppered around in this workshop. I'm happy to share that knowledge. I'm also a published game designer. I've published Seize the Day along with Christina Fernandez. And this game was published by Dice Toy Labs, which is Falcon and team, who many of you all may be familiar with. I've also written rule books for 5 different games, and these range from different types of audiences, right from the age of 4 plus to the more mature audiences that look after Euro games. So before we get into the meat of things, to make the most of today, what I would request you to do, if you've not already done so, is to keep a pen and a paper handy, or you could keep a notepad or an iPad or whatever you use to scribble notes on handy. This will help you to, one, take down notes, to put down your thoughts, and also to be able to do the exercise that we plan towards the end of the workshop in a very effective manner. If you have one of your previous rule books of any of the games that you've created or of a work in progress rule book, keep that handy. The concepts that you learn in this workshop should help you to refine that particular rule book. If you don't have any rule books handy, that's not a problem. What you could do is just refer to any of the games that you might have lying around the house. Pick up any one of them, and we could use that as an exercise. Or if there's a favorite game that you have, feel free to Google the rule book post this workshop. You should be able to find PDFs of most of the rule books available online, or you can just reach out to me and I'll help you with a rule book copy. And as far as possible, if you can set yourself up in a space that helps you think, so a quiet space where you can, focus on the workshop, and also ensure that you put down your thoughts and keep an open mind. That's what I would recommend. What we are going to go through in this workshop is not set in stone. It's not prescriptive. It's something that you can sort of decide to take up or ignore or use within your existing style. So, as with general writing, there's no fixed rule set that applies to this. We are just going to share knowledge with you, and if that's useful to you, great, amazing. You can take that forward, and I'm hoping that at the end of this workshop, you'd be able to, set up your own style in writing rule books. So this session is being recorded for the public archive. It will be on YouTube. And if possible, I would request the members to keep your cameras on. If you're not too shy, it'll help me to see all of you. I have a big screen in front of me, and I've got my mobile in front of me, which is where the video is coming from. It'll help if I can see the rest of the participants as well. That makes me more comfortable, if I may. And for the benefit of everyone, if people are not speaking, if you could please have your mics on mute, it's just helpful for the rest of the participants. Great. So, having said that, here's the schedule for day one. We are going to go through what effectively is a rulebook. We look at some key user experience concepts. This is from the world of UX that I come from. We look at how to structure a rule book, and then we'll move into how to keep it as simple as possible. And once we've simplified, we'll look at how we can keep it as consistent as possible. And we'll follow this up with an exercise, which is towards the end of this workshop. And what we'll do is in day two, we will start reviewing those exercises after diving quite deep into some more concepts tomorrow, once we've primed you up today. If you have any questions, do feel free to put those questions up on the chat channel. I'll be looking at the chat channel on my mobile. So we'll ensure that some of those chats are answered to. Do feel free to also use the raise hand feature. I should be able to see your hand raised over here, and I can then take up any questions. The format of this workshop is intended to be as interactive as possible, and I will take certain breaks between slides to allow the participants as well to ask any questions that I will try my best to answer. Wonderful. So, like I said, at the end of this, these are the outcomes that you should set for yourself. One is how you should be able to structure your own rule book, applying all the concepts that you've learned, weeding out any inconsistencies that you may have in your current rule texts, and of course, finding your own path and style. And this, of course, is an iterative process. It's not going to happen in like 2 days, but you can definitely evolve this over the next couple of weeks and months as you write more. So I'll start off with a quick question, and you could put this into the chat box as you recall them. So the first question that I have is, what are your favorite rule books? And from your favorite rule book, what is the one thing that you remember that stood out in that particular rule book, either that helped you or that was a hindrance to your overall gameplay? So if you could put that down in the chat individually, that would help. And we'll use some of this information as we go forward towards the end of this workshop. The second thing that you should probably think about and put down is, what's the one thing you wish was done better in this particular rule book that you're putting up? So if it's a rule book that you absolutely love, there will still be something that you'd wish would have been done better. So thank you, Falcon. That you wish could have been done better. And if you could put that in the chat, that will also help us towards the end of this workshop, and we can look at that as part of the exercise as well. I'll give all our participants maybe a minute to think and put that down. It's now 11:09. I'll restart at 11:10. Don't feel shy. This is a safe space. Nobody is going to be judging. And I'll try and ensure as far as possible that There's no judgment, there's nothing past. It's completely free. Feel free to let your creative mind flow. You have about 30 seconds more. So the question is, what is the one thing that you remember of your favorite rule book? And what is the one thing that you wish could have been done better? So when we say one thing you could remember, it could either mean from your most favorite rule book or from your most hated rule book. And that's what we're looking at in the chat. So we've already got a couple of answers. Wonderful. We have a story-based one. We've got pictorial representation. We've got pictorial representation twice. Rule books with visuals that have example moves, examples, key point, pair. All right, so you can continue to put down and we'll move to the next slide. And we'll start off now with the actual meat of this workshop. So fundamentally, when you're designing your rule book, the most important thing to consider is that the rule book that you're writing is not for yourself. And this is true with any product that you design. At the end of the day, there is someone that you're designing this rule book for. You have to consider who is the person that you are writing for. Visualize this person in your mind. It could be a single person, it could be maybe two or three different types of people if your game caters to different kinds of people. For example, with Seize the Day, the game catered to effectively, the rule book rather, catered to two kinds of audiences. The first audience was the parent, who would be the one that would teach the child to get the game right. And the second kind of rulebook was a slightly mid-range age, which would be above the age of 8 or 9, that is able to read for themselves and that is able to interpret visuals. So what we did within the rulebook was we had a couple of visuals that helped anyone who's reading it to set up easily, and conditions as well are also very clearly defined. So this helps, both kinds of audiences, the kind that would explain the game to the player and the player who's actually reading it. The second important part that you need to consider, and this is where we generally have this trap where we say, oh, we like the rule book, why don't you like it? But fundamentally, the person who's reading the rule book is the person who is supposed to get the maximum out of it. And should be able to ensure that they understand as much as possible so that they can get the gameplay experience right. Your rulebook effectively is the gateway to ensure that the game that you've designed and the game that you've created is played in the way that you intend the player to play. And that's where it has to be as simple as possible and definitely be targeted to the audience and to the player itself. And thirdly, like Bruce Lee said, be water, be as flexible as possible. There is no fixed style with writing a rule book. You might do different games. In some games, you might have a completely casual kind of language, a completely visual kind of rule book, like Honey Scouts. That's one of the examples that was put down, or even Scrabble. That's one of the examples that put down, where the rule book is very visual. And in some cases, you might have rule books that really need a lot of reading to be done because there are a lot of conditions within the game that may not be possible to fulfill using visuals. So, as far as possible, be flexible. You might have to be flexible even within your own rulebook itself. There might be certain sections, like say setup, for example, that need to be visual. and certain sections where conditions are placed, and the conditions must be clearly understood in order for the gameplay to be successful. So, as far as possible, be as flexible as you can in whatever you're writing. And don't forget, don't be shy to scratch off anything that you've done as well. If you feel that a rule doesn't work, scratch it off, rewrite it later, revisit it later, but keep revising and constantly revising your rules. So, fundamentally, when you start off, think about certain key parameters. Why is a user reading your rulebook? And we'll open up the floor for maybe a couple of more inputs after this few sets of points. So, one reason that a user would be reading your rulebook is because they're new to the game, and they require a complete explanation of the game, which includes what are the kind of components you have, how does the game play. They're just removing it from the box. They have no idea what your game is based on, no idea about the components, no idea how the play is going to be done. So this is a completely new kind of user who has no idea about the game. The second kind of person would be somebody who wants to set up the game. And to be able to do that, they should either have very effective verbal cues, which means that they should have verbal information that is useful to them, or they should have visual information that's available to them. So again, coming back to Scrabble, Scrabble has visual information that helps you set up the game. Honey Scouts as well has got visual information that helps you set up the game. Uh, the third kind of player is somebody who's already playing frequently and who's looking for maybe a quick reference to a particular rule because they want to solve, say, an in-game dispute that's taking place. An example could be with a game that's quite complex. For example, say it's a game like Century Spice. You want to know what is it that a particular card does. What does the action of that card mean? And secondly, when does the action of that card apply? So that's when you might go back to the quick reference guide and say, okay, I need to exchange, say, 3 reds for a brown. And that's the action that I can take on my turn. So that's also a quick reference that a player might want to look up while they are actually playing the game very quickly, rather than having to go through the whole rule book. And then there are certain players who need key concepts that they would highlight or teach within their game group. And I'm sure with all of us who are gamers over here, you would have quite a few members in your group who are usually the explainers of a game. And these are the kind of players also that you might want to think about and target. And of course, all of these depend fundamentally on what is the kind of game that you have. Is it a party game? Is it a game that is maybe between two players, in which case you may not need some of these elements? So is it a game which is for, say, 6 or 7 or 8 players, where you are likely to have more disputes? So think about all of these things as well. And it's not just that each of these points cater to a different kind of reader. It could be the same reader of these rules that uses these points in this context at different points in time. So it could be the same person who's trying to understand the game, the same person who's later down the line trying to find a quick reference, and the same person who's also trying to resolve an in-game dispute or even explain it to the rest of the family. So that is that it could be different use cases, but a different kind of a user but the same kind of user rather, that would be looking at resolving for each of these cases. So as far as possible, try and think about all of these cases, and you can optimize your rulebook then as far as possible. And this is completely dependent on the game itself as well, like I said earlier. Uh, we can take a couple of audio messages now. If anybody would like to raise their hand in terms of why else do you think a reader would be reading your rulebook? I'll keep the floor open for maybe about 30 seconds. Feel free to raise your hand, and or just feel free to unmute yourself and say it out, and we'll add it to the deck as well. Anyone? Don't feel shy. Don't worry. Nobody's judging. Okay, well, feel free to put it in the chat in that case, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, or to add on to this list. So, moving on to the next part, let's look at certain key concepts which come in from the UX space. So, like we spoke about in the previous set of information we were looking at, which is what is it that the user is looking out of, looking to gain from your rulebook, and two, who is the person who's going to be reading the rulebook. So that audience analysis is absolutely critical. Know your audience, know who is it that you're writing for, and know exactly what they want. What will help you to build up what this audience is looking for is what is known as a user persona. So we in the UX field, when we create a system, or when we create a design, or when we create an experience, we think about the user in terms of a fixed person. And we'll actually look at how we do that in the subsequent slide. So you think of your user as a fixed person. You think of what is it that they want, what is it that irritates them, what are the challenges that they may face, and what is any other key critical information that they would be looking out for from your rulebook. Once we've done this audience persona, we then leverage another tool which is called empathy. So we empathize with this particular personality. We try to put ourselves in this person's shoes. So here's where the whole concept of not writing to for yourself comes in. You sort of project yourself onto a different persona, and you put yourself in that person's shoes, and then write your rules and evaluate it within that context. That helps you to ensure that the audience that you're writing for is basically the writing that is meant for that particular audience. The next piece is clarity. So clarity as well is very, very important whenever you're writing. You need to be clear in terms of what is it that the reader should be doing. So if somebody reads a particular rule, don't make it ambiguous. If it can be simplified, keep it as simple as possible. Which is the next thing. The next point is cognitive load. And cognitive load effectively is the amount of information that the human mind can process. Keep in mind that unlike computers that have a vast set of information that they can keep in mind and recall and remember at any point in time, as human beings we have our limitations. So the simpler we make things, the easier it is. For example, if you created a sentence which was 50 words long, uh, it would be very difficult for somebody to be able to understand that entire sentence. But if you broke that up within maybe five different sentences of 10 words each, it would be a lot easier for somebody to understand it and to be able to take it in. And we'll go through various areas of cognitive load as we process and move forward through this workshop. And we'll look at specific techniques to ensure that we reduce cognitive load. The next thing that you need to keep in mind is consistency. Whenever you've gone to Google, right, or whenever you've used Google, one of the key things that you see is consistency. There's always a login button that is placed on the right hand side. You see your profile image that tells you, hey, okay, I'm the person that's logged into the system. Or I know that if I need to do a search, for example, I have to directly click on the search bar, or I just open up google.com and type things in. And this consistency basically builds a habit with users. And once the user is familiar with your structure, for them it becomes more a matter of recognition rather than a matter of remembering. And you have to always keep in mind that in terms of human behavior, it is far more easy for us to recognize things than to recall. Uh, and the reason being, relying on memory is not very effective because every person's memory may be different, and you're going to make each person then remember a lot of information. But if you use terms that are familiar, if you use icons that are repeated throughout your rule book and throughout your manual, you can build the habit with the user and build that understanding with the user that, for example, a red light indicates stop, or a hand button indicates stop, or a hand icon rather indicates stop. So that consistency is extremely important to be able to build that familiarity with the user that you'll then use to ensure that they have great experience during your game. And finally, the most important key point, and this is what many of us as user experience designers or even as game designers and rulebook writers fail to do, and this includes myself. So testing and iterating with real people is absolutely necessary. You need to do this even with a rough structure of your rule book. That's fine. Test it, take it to a real person, put it on a WhatsApp group, ask somebody to read it, ask them for their feedback, and don't ask them. So typically, what happens is when somebody gives you feedback, they will try and tell you fix this or fix that. Don't take it personally. Put down all of the points and think about why that particular feedback is coming in, and that will definitely help you identify what the root of the problem is. So here's an example of a persona. Right, we spoke about audience analysis, we spoke about understanding our audiences, and we spoke about writing for that right kind of audience and empathizing with them. So one of the tools that will help you to identify with your audience is what we call personas. And you can easily build a persona. These are some of the key elements that I've put down, but of course you can put down multiple other different elements as well. So in this case, for example, if we are creating a rule book for a casual game, which is slightly tilted to the Euro space. So, say, for example, a game like Century Spice or Splendor. You might say, okay, my target audience is in the range of, say, 20-ish to maybe about 35, 40-ish. There are people who are just, who want to get to play quickly. They are slightly impatient. And they want to be able to explain the rules later as well because they are sort of the explainer of the groups. So what we do is we don't say they in that case. We turn it into an actual persona and an actual person. In this case, Shashi Tapas, where we're saying that Shashi is between 24 and 34 years old. His highest degree of education, and we are putting this into to sort of put ourselves into his shoes and say, okay, this is the level of reading that he's usually used to. So we're saying, okay, he's done his bachelor's degree, so he may be fairly competent in reading English as well, which means that the English language that we use for our book should be fairly structured. It doesn't need to be extremely simplified. What are his objectives? So we are saying when Shashi plays a game, Shashi wants to play quickly. Also, once he's done playing, he wants to be the person in the group that always explains the games later. So he'll explain the rules to others, and he will focus on the game over the rules when he's playing. He is an avid gamer. He wants to be able to focus on the game itself rather than keep referring to the rule book. And how does he usually gain information? So usually when Shashi is opening up a new box, he'll either watch Rodney Split, explain rules and watch it played, or he might even read the rule book. So he's definitely one of your audiences that would use two sources of information. And you should think about that and maybe leverage that as well when you're writing for him. And what are his key challenges? So typically when he's trying to read a rule book or when he's trying to play a game, his key challenges are, okay, what are the key rules? He doesn't remember them very well. Uh, he has a lot of disputes with the other players that are there, or he plays with lots of players where there are disputes. So it's important that he has maybe a ready reference to be able to resolve that dispute. And he wants to be able to search for a relevant rule whenever he needs to. So that means that he needs clarity and a very concise index possibly where he could quickly reach a particular place in the rule book that will give him the information that he's looking for. And what is it that you're expecting Shashi to use most during a game? So Shashi typically looks at the rules glossary, or he looks at a card which he places in front of him, for example, like Catan, or he looks at a quick play guide that he refers to whenever he's either setting up the game or whenever he's looking at the initial turn order of the game to start with. So if you build a persona like this, and these personas are completely dependent on your game. In this case, I've just taken an example persona for, say, a Century Spice or a Splendor. But in the case of your game, what you ideally need to do is think about who's your audience, then put it down in the form of a persona by thinking about their challenges, and finally map it to a real person. And when you do that, you'll now be able to say, okay, I'm writing for Shashi. I'm no longer writing for myself. So if I were to write the rule book this way, what would Shashi say? what would what would he how would he react if he read this particular rule? Do you think he'd be able to understand it? Would me as Shashi be able to comprehend it quickly, or would I need to further keep reading it twice or thrice to be able to understand? And when you do that, you're able to put yourself into your user's shoes, and thus you're able to write in a very relevant manner for that particular user. If anyone has any questions on personas, please feel free to ask me now. You can either raise your hand or unmute yourself and address the question. I'm happy to answer it. All right, so we'll move forward. And it's very important to know that any process is not set in stone. What I'm going to show you now is a process that I typically follow, and this is also a process that stems from the UX space. It's a process that maybe you'd like to follow that might help you with any further rule books that you're creating from start to finish. So, one, it's an iterative process, it's circular, and it's a never ending process because what will happen is till the time that you're absolutely satisfied with your rulebook, you will continue with this process over and over, and you'll follow these steps over and over. The first part of the process is to, yes, Shruti, please go ahead. Shruti, you need to unmute yourself if you're speaking.
Oh, sorry. Hello.
Yes, go ahead. Okay, I think we've lost Shruti to a connection, so we'll continue. Yes, Trunk Works. If you could also tell us your name and address your question.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, this is Malini. So I'm a partner at Trunkworks. My question was that if you're designing a rule book for multiple audiences, in the sense both parents and slightly older, maybe say a sibling or a caregiver, then would you design to multiple personas? Because clearly those are very different uh, characteristics for both audiences, right?
Absolutely right, and that's a good question. Whenever you're designing your rulebook for a set of different audiences, you should do different personas. The idea with doing different personas is to ensure that whenever you're capturing your rulebook information and evaluating it, you say how do you empathize with a kid versus a caregiver versus say a regular player, and when you evaluate your overall rule book, you'll write it and evaluate it within that particular framework. So say for example, when I wrote C's, we kept in mind that there's a child also that would be at the heart of these things. So we had a bit of diagrams. We kept in mind there was a parent, so we ensured that there was text as well that backed it up. And we also kept in mind that there was a middle audience, which is why we added a lot of examples to cater to that audience as well. So in that way, you cater to all these different personas. And then when you evaluate your rulebook again, you say, okay, how does it satisfy the needs of persona 1 versus persona 2 versus persona 3? So it could be, for example, a Shashi Tapas versus a Franz Dias versus, say, an Amol Dadan.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. We had another question as well from Siva.
Hey Franz,
Siva
hi.
Chandana. Hi.
Hi. This is Shivachandana here. Yeah, so you talked about personas and then empathizing with the customer, right? So suppose I want to introduce the concept of shapes so that people who are colorblind also can use my game. So how relevant would it be to do something like that in a game which I'm releasing in India? Or is it more relevant if I am ready to export it out of India?
It's that's again a great question, and we have covered color blindness as a part of this. It's extremely important. In fact, I would say one of the challenges here would be color blindness. So I would say Shashi Tapas has a red and green color blindness factor, and he's unable to tell between red and green. Which is why when you're then doing your rule book, you'd probably look at doing basically double factor, where you say you define in text as well as define by pattern or by color. Definitely very important, and not just from an international audience point of view, but I think it's the right thing to do even for an Indian audience.
Okay. Even for Indian audience, you say that it's very important,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Okay.
yes. Double coding
Because
is very
I
important.
because I was just looking up in the internet about the percentage of children and elders who are prone to color blindness, and I felt that it was not much in India. So I was just wondering that if you could answer that, it would be great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I think it's the numbers reported are not much, but definitely I think in terms of percentages, we have a fair share of population that is also colorblind. I know for sure that there are people who have issues with colors, especially red and green. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Okay. Shruti, you had a question. If Shruti is joined us back, we lost you midway.
Yeah, hi, Frank.
Hi.
Sorry, I think I just got cut right in between. But I think from what I understand or what I heard after I joined back, I think you answered a part of the question.
All right. Okay. Perfect. Thank you
My
for that.
question
So,
was your in terms of a user profile, you're looking at one single profile, but yeah,
yes, so we would have multiple profiles for sure. It's not fixed one, and typically, whenever you're designing, especially a complex game, you might want to definitely consider having different kinds of player personas that are put in place.
multiple class of people who are going to be playing.
That's correct. I wouldn't say class
Hello.
of people, but I would say types of people. Uh, Shruti, I think you have a bad
Okay.
connection, but I'll answer your question. So I wouldn't say class of people, but I would say look at it from an actual person point of view. When we say type of person, it could be,
Okay.
say, somebody who is from a school, or somebody who's not necessarily a casual gamer, somebody who's opened up a board game for the first time in their life, things like that. So consider it from
Right.
that particular point of view.
Okay.
All right. Perfect. Thank you for that question. So, coming to the process, the first part of the process is to empathize with that persona that we've created. And how do we do that? We do that by saying who is it that we are writing for, and we've covered how we actually put down the person in a proper structure and say, I'm actually writing for Shashi Tapas. And when I look at my rule book and when I review my rule book, I'm going to review it in Shashi Tapas's shoes. The next step is to actually write the rules, and this could be a very rough structure. Write down your key content. Put down your key content. It could be in a notepad. The key content effectively is what are the base rules of your game. How does the player win your game? How does your player do a round? And how is it that your game ends? Once you put down this key content, turn it into a prototype and put it together roughly. So you've got it maybe in a sheet of paper, either take a picture of it or put it down on a Word document, and then you can just circulate it within your WhatsApp group, which is the next phase, testing. So when you test your game, get opinions. That's important. You have your prototype that is ready, which is rough. Send it to as many people as possible. We have our game design group as well. That there are many instances where people send rule books across, and I believe that that has helped with ensuring that their rule book gets better and better. And once you've done this testing, again, go back to the drawing board, empathize with the people that have reviewed your rulebook, empathize with your personas, and go back to writing your content. So you'll then start refining your content. Once you've refined it, go back to prototyping, again, test, Once if you're happy with the test, you can go ahead, publish the rule book. If you're not, you can keep continuing this in a circular manner. It's important to note that this is also something that can be put into place after you've published your game. So, and this has happened with some of the games that we've seen in the market as well. You find errors in the rule book. Again, that's where you go back, you empathize, rewrite those errors into the rules, ensure that you've prototyped them, and then got opinions. How do you do this? These are the key tools that I've put down. Pen and paper for writing your key content. You can use something like a Word or a Google Docs. That's easy to share. And getting opinions is as simple as sending it across to your friends, your family, the Design Labs group on WhatsApp. There's also a rulebook writing group that is present on WhatsApp as well. So moving into structure when you actually start writing down your key components. And what I've put up here is the structure of Scythe. I'm sure many of us have played Scythe or heard of Scythe for sure. Uh, when you look at the table of contents of Scythe, you'll see that it is extremely well structured. It starts off with the components. It talks about certain important key components and then what are the various. So if you see the way that it goes down, there's a flow of information. Components, then you filter down to what are the important concepts. You filter further down based on what are the types of units that fulfill those concepts. And once you've given your player that overall idea, you start off with, okay, what is the setup of the game? Then they go through how the game is actually played. You talk about more key information such as the faction abilities. And if you see the way faction abilities is specifically called out is because in game with Scythe, typically faction abilities are one of the things that is usually debated. So it's a very easy, quick reference that happens. Combat is also one of the pieces that happens very frequently during Scythe. And that's why that's specifically called out. And then you have other key areas that have been put down. So you've got encounters, you've got objectives of the game. Uh, and objectives with Scythe is it's a specific card. It's not necessarily the overall game objective itself. That's defined right at the start. And finally, you have the game end and scoring. And you'll notice that that's placed immediately after placing stars. So for those of you who've played Scythe or those of you who haven't, the game end in Scythe is triggered at the end of placing stars. When somebody's placed a certain number of stars, the game ends immediately. And then finally, you have the characters and certain highlighted rules. So, and immediately at the side of it, you see global components. So you have all the main components that a player would see at the time that they're opening up their box, and then you actually move into setup. So this follows the same process of discovery as a user who is actually opening up your box. So you say, okay, when a user opens up the box, the first thing they see is the rule book. They lift up the rule book. They're looking at the list of global components in their hand in the rule book, and they're looking at the list of global components in the box. So it's correlated to what's actually happening within the game. So I'll run through a couple of points in terms of structure. For starters, typically your game could be one of two types, right? It could be either a game that is heavily theme dependent or a game that is heavily mechanic dependent. For a game that is theme dependent, you want to definitely establish what is it that your game is based on. You want to tell that story of the game because that story will then draw the user or the reader into that game universe. And once you've drawn them into that game universe in maybe just a few lines, you then give them the context of the rest of your components or the rest of your gameplay within that universe. So, for example, with Splendor, you say, okay, you're looking at attracting the eyes of merchants, and in order to do that, you're effectively a gem dealer or a gem collector who goes around collecting the best of gems. And once you've done that, you then present it to the merchants and you attract their eyes and you score those extra points. So that's how they link the theme to the actual scoring of the game itself, which is a key part of the game. So establish a story, tell people what the concepts are, narrate those concepts and narrate those key terms. So you want to definitely put out the key terms that you're going to be using in your game early on in the game. And of course, this can also be a trap, and we'll come to it when we are talking more about cognitive load, because you want to ensure that your game terms are something that are familiar. it's something that people are used to. So it's easier to for somebody to recognize something rather than for them to get a new concept and then keep remembering it. For example, if you were to say a player flies from one end to another versus a player takes the dirigible from one end to the other, it will be far more difficult for you to get the second statement correct, because one, they'll have to understand what a dirigible is, then they'll have to understand how that movement happens. But when you say fly from one end to another, it's an immediate click that happens, because that's a word that is already very common, not just in board game parlance, but also in the usual scheme of things. It's something that people are already used to. So, as far as possible, try and simplify while you do keep your theme in place. And of course, if you can illustrate the components that you would have in your game box at the start of your rulebook, this really helps because it aids with setup. It also aids with recall. A player looks at, for example, a round token with a star in it, and they immediately identify that, okay, this is the point scoring token in the box, and I'm supposed to be using it for point scoring later on. Also, introduce your setup of the game. So typically what happens in a game is the first thing you do before even starting your gameplay is you set up the game board, and then you try to figure out how to actually do the gameplay. So setup is the next most important key part. Identify what are the zones within your game that will help with setup. So where does your draw pile sit? Where does, say, the discard pile sit? What is it that you put back into the box? Is there a specific play area where you keep your pile of coins? Is there a bank, and so on? And try and illustrate it as far as possible. Of course, this is something you do with the graphic designer, but ensure that as far as possible you have an illustration of at least the initial state of the board game. It helps players who are starting off for the first time. We then go into the meat and potatoes, potatoes for the vegetarians, of course. Uh, what is it that's most important next? An overview of the gameplay. So, what are the general, what's the course that you would typically take in a typical gameplay of the game? And what are the general terms that you use when you're playing a game? Do you say gain a knowledge? Do you say collect a power? Do you say collect a token? Establish those terms early on, because when you're using those terms further on in the rule book, that's something that people are already then familiar with. And as far as possible, try and simplify, try and use something that is already common versus using any other new words that you might take up. Try and introduce icons as far as possible in the game as well. So wherever you have an icon on your card, try and use the same icon within your rulebook. This helps with reducing the cognitive load. The reason is people recognize visuals, and that's again some of the examples that we saw on both Scrabble as well as on Honey Scouts in the examples that were shared early on when we started this workshop. Visuals help you to understand and to remember and recall things far easier. In fact, they reduce the need for remembering, because it's just something visual that keeps striking you, that you keep recognizing. The next thing that you want to talk about is the round structure. So talk about what happens in a set of turns. What comprises of a round? Is a round a sum total of turns? Is it one turn itself? You need to define that early on in the game. What happens? Does your round happen sequentially? How does it move? Does it move clockwise? Does it happen at the same time? Are there any actions that you need to be careful of that happen during that particular round? Do players take the action simultaneously? Are there actions that happen at the end of the round or at that particular player's turn as well? So things like that are very important. Then talk about a turn structure. Now you've given your reader the idea of what does a round comprise of. You now go further deeper and say, okay, this is the actual structure of a turn. On your turn, you will pick a tile, you will look at that tile, keep it hidden, or you'll place it down, you'll score a point, you'll move your track marker. It's very important to have things that happen on your turn very, very explicitly defined. I would go more or towards ensuring that we have more description than lesser description. Keep in mind that at the end of your overall writing, go back to your overall persona, read it out in the shoes of that particular persona, and think for yourself as to whether, if you were Shashi Tapas, would you want to have to reread this? Is there more information you would like to see? Or is there more information that has been defined? And could it be simplified even further? talk about the turn details, talk about phase details, talk about the action details as well. So wherever your action is complex, definitely you need to detail that out. You also need to talk about what happens before your action and what happens after your action. This is absolutely key in a game where the action is circular in nature and where another player's action, the next player's action is dependent on what you've placed. So if, for example, you've placed a coin down and the next player could either take that coin or place another coin on top of it, that's an action that happens after your immediate action. So think about what happens before, what happens on the turn, and what happens after the turn. And it's important to test this. The reason being, if you don't test this, you'll find out later on in the game when it may be a little too late to restructure thing that you need to revise or be more explicit in your descriptions. And define the end game trigger. This is something that I personally do at the start of my game. I define to my reader as to what is it, how does a user end the game. It could be in a simple line that says you win the game when you've collected 7 stars. But that has a very clear definition for the reader that my goal effectively as a part of the gameplay mechanic is to collect 7 stars. If I've collected those 7 stars, I've won the game. Also, define the trigger as well. And when you're doing that later on, after you're done with your overall turn phases and turn details, make sure that that endgame trigger is explicitly defined. If there are several endgame triggers, make sure you define that. If they need to take place in order, define that as well. And also, as far as possible, if there are any edge cases here, in case of a tiebreaker, you need to definitely define that, because tiebreakers are one of the key things that typically do happen, especially in games that have scoring mechanics. Also, if there's a score calculation, this is you'd be defining at this particular point in time. So if your calculation is complex, try and put down a table. If it's really complex, like in the case of Wingspan, you actually need to give your players a small little book or a format on which they can use to calculate that score. Don't leave it up to the player. It will leave a bad taste in their mouth if they're unable to calculate their scores at the end of a session of gameplay. And towards the end of your rulebook, try and add your edge cases, try and add in your FAQs, your glossary of terms, as well as the credits to the game. So some of the things that are important also is, does your game need a quick reference guide? Are the turns on your game very complex? If you do need a quick reference guide, it's important to have one. For example, with Catan, what they do is, and this quick reference guide with Catan is effectively to reduce the cognitive load again. Here, you're not trying to get a user to remember that, for example, if I need to build a city, I've got to use two hay and 3 ore. So that's very important to have as a quick reference guide in terms of a game like this. And with the expansions as well, you'll see that they do have expansions for the scientific buildings, the aqueducts, and so on. Also, try and create a sheet if your game is complex enough, and if it merits that, a sheet to resolve common queries. Where do you get these common queries from? You'll get them from your playtesting. Typically, when you're playtesting, try and record as far as possible what is the most common query that a user is posing to you. What is it that your players are telling you? If the query keeps repeating itself, you might definitely want to put it together in an FAQs document or in a quick reference guide. So we are almost towards the end of today's session. Actually, we might overshoot by say about 10 minutes. But I would like all of you to choose a game now. At the start of the session, we said we choose a game, and we then go and maybe look at certain rules within that particular game and review that tomorrow. So I'd like everyone to choose a game. You don't need to tell me what the game is in the chat, but you could choose it. It could be a game that you would have liked or that you've already put down in the chat. It could be one of your own games. Choose that game and we look at a particular section within that game which you'll refine. We're going to evaluate also that game now within the context of the next couple of slides. And I want you to think for yourself as to how is it that each of these points relates to that particular game. So the first part is how do you keep things simple, right? We said clarity is really important as part of the UX concepts. So avoid jargon and especially manufactured jargon, right? Uh, it could be something like kerfluffle the other player, right? That's a name that's very difficult. Rather, it's as easy to say attack the other player, or this move will attack a particular player, or use the attack move. That's even simpler. Use a similar term whenever you're doing your rule book, especially in the case of various different components, right? Uh, Rather than saying, for example, what does this game contain? Use a term like components. Components is something that's familiar, or parts. That's something that's very familiar with people who don't even play board games, right? So try and use terms that are familiar, points in terms of what people would relate with when they're going about their daily life as well. Because keep in mind that not everybody who is opening up your game box is a gamer. As far as possible, try and avoid articles, simplify things as far as possible. Avoid colon after titles. This is one of my pet peeves with anything that I read. A colon after a title is not really required, right? It's a title in itself. You can just as easily highlight it by either making it bold or using an underline, and then just moving the text to the next line. You don't need to use a colon after it. Wherever there's an important concept that you found out during your playtests, or that you as a designer want to highlight to your reader, use a call out. So a call out is effectively a small little box that you would have at the side of your rules that that highlights and says, okay, this particular point is important. That's a good point. Edge, adjacent versus orthogonal. And actually, that's a tricky one because both edge adjacent and orthogonal are not points that are usually used in daily parlance. So simplify as far as possible. And whenever you're writing your rule book, make sure that you leave comments for your graphic designer. This is important because when your graphic designer may not be co-located at the same space that you're working in. He might be either sitting in a different country or maybe sitting in a different city or a different building itself, right? So you want to leave instructions for your graphic designer and keep them as explicit as possible. For example, this part needs to be highlighted. This needs to be a specific note. This is an important title. This is a separate section. These parts are important for your graphic designer to be able to design the actual graphics of the rulebook. And keep things consistent, right? So when you're making things consistent, and this is part of the guide as well that we've been going through. Framing is very important, right? And when you frame a sentence, you frame it keeping the context in mind. So one of the things that you would typically want to do is put a condition before an action. Let me give you an example. So if I say, so we'll consider a gate that has to open for cars to enter in, right, as a part of the game. If we say the gate opens when a car enters in and the gate closes when a car exits. That's not very clear. What you would want to ideally do is put a condition before it. That easily illustrates to the reader that whenever a particular action happens, so when a car is at the gate opens. When the car enters the gate closes. When the car exits the gate opens. When the car completes the exit, the gate closes. Put a condition before the action itself, and that definitely helps. The next thing you want to do is simplify your sentence. And like we said earlier, rather than having a 50-word sentence, you might want to break your sentence into 5 different sentences of 10 words each. That definitely helps the user because remember, we are always talking about cognitive load. The more load we place on a user and the more we make them remember, or the more we make the mind process, the more difficult it is for them to be able to understand. And when we have 5 different sentences of 50 words each, think of how much more complex it's going to become for your user to be able to read. Also, try and use abbreviations that are common typically. Avoid abbreviations that are very close together, right? So, for example, if you have an abbreviation that says emergency vehicle rescue, and then you have another abbreviation that says emergency medical rescue. You have an abbreviation now that says EVR versus EMR, and that can become very confusing for your users, especially if those terms are important in your game. So if, for example, you had an EVR move and you had an EMR move, you had two different vehicles within a particular game, it would be very difficult for the user to constantly keep remembering those, and they're likely to get confused between the movement of the EVR versus the movement of the EMR. So as far as possible, try and use your naming in such a way that the naming itself creates abbreviations that are significantly different. Also, in terms of the triggers and the conditions and the effect, you need to ensure that wherever you're using your triggers, your game triggers, you have them maybe either called out or kept in a separate format or used in a certain language. And don't change that language throughout the game. So, for example, if you say, whenever you pick up a token, gain 1 point. Don't go to another paragraph and say, uh, pick up a token to get 1 point. Use that same consistency that you've used in the first sentence. Whenever you pick up a token, gain 1 point. Use that same kind of statement as far as possible throughout the rest of the game. Because what happens is when you phrase the same thing differently, you're making the person who's reading it process it again and again and again and process the same thing in different ways. And that creates a lot of scope for confusion. Also, your choice of words has to be as one, as simple as possible. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't try and create a new word. Use a word that is familiar with normal daily conversation. And as far as possible, try and use words that are gender neutral, right? So rather than saying he or she, maybe use a they. That makes your game gender neutral. Or if you even want to say the player, you could do that as well. Typically, but when so there's a difference, of course, between using the player or you. You say you, and I usually use you when I'm trying to create a game which is for fewer players, because that makes it much more personal, much more intimate. The player feels that we're talking to them. When we use the player, for example, it becomes a lot easier in games that are in games that have many more players. So there's really no preferred grammatical person. It depends on the game. My rule of thumb, and this may not apply to everyone, is whenever it's a game that has under 4 players, I stick to you or they. Whenever it's whenever it's a game that has a large number of players, I would typically use third person, which is the player. So that's pretty much the end of today's session. A couple of other things that I'd want to cover. One is the use of title case, and we'll take a couple of questions as well. I'm seeing a few questions coming up in the chat. So the use of title case is typically used when you want to call out a specific component, right? So if you're giving particular importance to that component, you give it title case. For example, when it's a name, you always use title case because that name has a certain amount of importance to the game. If it's, say, for example, a flower token, right? And the flower token is an object within the game that is repeatedly referred to, you might want to put that in title case with a capital F and a capital T. Let me look at some of the questions that's here. Can different words with the same starting letter be used? Yeah, so this is part of the guide as well. And you can use the same starting letter for different components. What the guide references and what I agree with as well from a UX perspective is within your index itself, right? Or when you have a list of all these components or rather a list of concepts that are important. If you use the same letter, it's not easy for somebody who's looking for a particular piece of information to be able to find it. By creating that differentiator, you could tell somebody, for example, there's a difference between a tree versus a toe versus a trunk, maybe by saying this is tree, this is foot, and this is neck. By having these words start off with a different letter, what typically happens is visually it's easier to recognize, because then they're differentiated between the starting letter of the T, starting letter of the N, and starting letter of the F. And typically this is because of the way that we as human beings read things. When we read things, we tend to scan it, right? So you scan things really quickly, and you will typically ignore things that are the same. You'll notice this in most eye scanner tests as well. If it looks the same, you'll typically assume that it is the same, and you'll scan quickly to the next section. So that's where this rule probably comes from. At least in terms of the UX space, I can tell you that's where it comes from. All right. Uh, if we have any more questions, feel free to put that in the chat. Otherwise, I will move into what is our exercise for tomorrow before we close for the day. I'll leave maybe 30 seconds open. Feel free to even just unmute yourself and ask questions. All right. So coming to our exercise for tomorrow, the first thing that all of us need to do is pick a rule book of your choice. It could be one of the games you've mentioned. It could be one of your favorite games, one of the games you're working on. Create a basic structure for that rule book. So you don't need to create a rule book for this exercise. Just create a structure. That's the first part of the exercise. Like the index that we saw in Scythe. I can bring up that reference so that, yeah, so this is a structure. It's like effectively a table. You could put it down as a table of contents. You don't need to put the page numbers. Just put it in the format of how you'd like to structure this particular rule book. The next thing you should do is take one of the rules that you want improved. So maybe take a couple of lines from the setup, or a couple of lines maybe on a turn. It could be just a single sentence. It could be just maybe 2 or 3 lines that you have within your existing rulebook. And using the principles that you've learned today and that we've spoken about today, uh, try and improve that and try and apply those principles to that particular set of rules. So you'll apply it to the structure of the rule book as well as to one of the rules you want improved. And what you should do is tomorrow, when you send it across to us, just put the before. So send us both the before and send us the after. If you'd like to put it on a slide, just on a basic slide, feel free to do that. You can have the before on the left-hand side, the after on the right-hand side. And what we'll do tomorrow is we'll spend about half an hour of this overall workshop going through each person's rules. Of course, this is on a voluntary basis. Whoever would like to volunteer and have the rules reviewed, feel free. You can put it up tomorrow, and we will do this together as a group. So it's not just me that's going to be reviewing it. We will together as a group share our feedback with you over chat and over voice, and you can then probably use that feedback to go ahead and improve your style later on. I just noticed a question. Is length a factor? So that's a tricky question because with rule books, right, you want to be as explicit as possible and you want to simplify as far as possible. It depends on the game, is what I would say. Two, it depends on the production cost. Ultimately, your rules will be converted to graphic design. Your graphic design will be converted to rule books. You typically go with the number of folds in production, right? So it's either a 4-pager, and it's then in multiples of 2 or a 4 when you keep adding pages, depending on the kind of fold that you're using. So I wouldn't say that length is a structure from an information point of view, but definitely from a production cost point of view. And this is maybe something that you want to consider when you start off doing your rule book as to how simplified you want it to be. But at the same time, do keep in mind that this is one of the areas where skimping budget may actually have a negative repercussion in the future, for the simple reason that it might come back as either fewer rules, or you might need to put in an addendum to your rule book, and that may increase your production costs later on. Yep. Any more questions? All right. So this is the end of day one. I hope all of you who attended today's workshop found it useful. Feel free as far as possible, if you'd like to add more to the chat. Feel free to add more to the chat. I am available over here for the next couple of minutes before we sign off. And this is pretty much the end of the workshop and the end of day one. We have other seminars as well. So They are available online. You can just go to the link that's up there, which is linktr.ee/MEEPLELabs, and you'll have access to all of these seminars. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. sharp, and I'm hoping to see all of you come with your rule books and the exercise done so that we're able to dive deeper into the concepts and then also review your rule books. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you, Franz. See you.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Franz. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.